Peter's studio is actually quite famous or infamous for its look. Richard, can you tell us about the moment you first walked in and saw the chaotic horror that is his studio?
Well, look, I certainly wouldn't describe it as chaotic horror. It was one of those places where you felt that painting happened. You know, it was and I'm sure still is, a place where there's lots of paint, where there's wonderful furniture. I mean, you had, I'm not sure whether you've still got them there, but some fantastic dilapidated chairs that you'd been painting.
Yeah, the chairs
it was a great active space.
Yeah. My studio is full of, I collect a lot of old and dilapidated chairs, and that's part of my genre. I work in doing series on chairs. And but oddly enough, when Richard saw my studio, in fact, it's not where I painted Richard. I painted Richard in Melbourne, where he was staying. So, in fact, there was a couple of options. We only had, well, I wanted Richard for the day. So it was much easier if I went over to see Richard than vice versa.
No, but there still is a connection. I'm trying to tease out your interest in old and dilapidated objects. Now, Richard.
Well, I'm feeling a significant sense of identity there. Thank you. Look, I have to say, actually, I would have loved to have been painted in Peter's studio, and I'd have loved to have sat in one of those dilapidated chairs. But as it was, I was doing some television recording in Melbourne, and Peter, whom with whom I'd become very friendly before he asked me to sit for him, said, "I'd like to paint you," but really the only time that we could find was in a sort of a period of time in a serviced apartment where I was staying. So Peter arrived at the apartment at an agreed time, and carted all of his paints in a lovely old paint box and a portable easel, and set up a big drop sheet on the floor of the apartment, and it was fascinating to see the process from there.
Yeah, I mean, Richard has to mention the drop sheet, because when I work, I'm actually a pretty messy sort of painter.
Very messy painter.
So, and a lot of people, when they paint, can... actually, I must mention the way I paint. I actually work in tone and not line. So I'm pushing paint around a lot. So I move around a lot when I paint. So the whole act is a physical act for me, and so...
okay, so explain that for us. So tone rather than line.
Well, I mean, a lot of artists would draw in the shape of the portrait. They might put the eyes in, they might put the nose, they might put the mouth. But I don't draw at all when I start to paint. I go straight in with the paint, and then I use tone to build up the shapes and form. So that's how the whole painting comes together it comes together very fast for me too. See, if you work in line, or if you work in line, you're more or less, and there's just a couple of ways of painting, but if you work in line, then what you're really doing is you're colouring in a part of it, and then you continue to work on that. So you don't go outside that line. But with the way I work, I'm working in a way that the paint actually moves, the edges move a lot around. So until the likeness itself probably doesn't come until the last hour or so. I mean, you get an idea what the painting's like, but it's just slowly building up.
This is interesting, though, because you're a senior lecturer in drawing for a whole lot of years, weren't you?
For 5 years I was out at Monash, but only on a temporary... I used to work Monash for 1 day a week, teaching drawing.
So you obviously love drawing, but you choose not to employ it in...
Oh, but no, I mean, drawing, I still think drawing is one of the most important things that an artist does. I think drawing is like, it's the bones of your painting. In fact, I don't go anywhere without a sketchbook.
But Richard, this is interesting. When Peter says you don't tell what's happening with the portrait until the last minute, is that discombobulating for the sitter when you go and peek around and see how it's going?
Well, actually, Peter was very, very strict about the peeking part. It was a fascinating process. I have to say, I really enjoyed the process of sitting while Peter painted, because he's very communicative, as you can tell, and it was lovely because you would talk to me about what you were doing and how you were doing it, and I guess I was certainly very curious about what was happening.
Yeah.
So he was explaining some of the sort of things that he's talking about now.
And from
how
your observation, what do you see? What do you see from...
I see the back of the canvas.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he literally wouldn't allow me to come and, even when we were having a break, to come and have a look in the early parts of the process. I think, I don't know, I didn't get the sense that you were being secretive, but part of the process was that you didn't want to reveal until you got a bit further down the track.
Yeah, I often turn, if you remember, I turned the painting upside down.
Well, I was going to mention that,
and,
yes.
and then you saw it upside down, so that was that was the closest you got for probably the first hour.
So why did you do that? Why did you...
For me, it's a tonal thing. I'm trying to look at, instead of looking at, this sounds a bit crazy in a way, instead of looking at Richard, what I'm really doing is looking at shapes. Just as when I start to build the painting up. So I'm looking at how the whole painting starts to negotiate in shapes. So what you're doing is when you're turning it upside down, it just becomes a total abstraction.
So you turn the canvas upside down.
Surely, that's only
surely
for
it
me.
would be better to get him to sit on his head.
Yeah, that's true. Well,
I
you could have done that, actually.
You'd have ended up with a very red face.
Yeah,
though,
that's
which,
right.
You know, could have been the thing. And Peter says he's a messy painter. He moves around a lot. What do you see from your side of the canvas?
Well, it was fascinating to see the whole process of him setting up and getting ready for action because, as I say, he arrived at the place that we were meeting and I helped him carry his paints and easel and so on. He set up this big drop sheet, put the easel there. And then the first process was this very careful squeezing out of a palette of paints. And I think you were saying at the time that this palette was a critical thing, you know, to get the right colours at the beginning. And so there was that process. And then as he started to paint, he really continued to talk about what he was doing. But, you know, you're really very vigorous. You know, you stand there and there's all this sort of movement of the arm and pushing and, you know, sort of standing back and going forward. And it's almost like a little bit of a dance in a way.
I think, Richard, you described it well. That's, in many ways, what I'm doing. I'm going forward and back quite a lot because I want to look at the work from a bit of a distance and then I make a mark. I've got this theory that says to me that every mark should have purpose. So when I put a mark down, it has a purpose. So this is the difference between if you were colouring in, you wouldn't have that sense of directness. But anyway, the other thing is too, I like to keep the work fresh so that the work itself has to have some sort of spontaneity to it.
And at what point do you turn it right way round again?
Oh, I only do that during the breaks. Yeah. But
Just,
it's really...
just so that when you walk back to the canvas, you get a fresh perspective.
Yeah, that's right. But then the other thing is too, it sort of gives Richard... He can't really have a complete look at it then, can he?
Actually, I should explain, if you don't mind me explaining. Do you mind me mentioning the mirror?
No, that's good.
No,
yeah.
because the reason that the painting goes upside down is...
We don't want to hear any stories about nudity.
No.
You know, if that's where this is going.
But this was a very strange experience being the person sitting because, as Peter was explaining, when he's trying to see my face or anybody else's face that he's painting, he's not just looking at the person, he's trying to look at the shapes and the shadows and the tones and so on. And to try and move away from the expectation of seeing a face, he turns it upside down. And so what he does is actually physically holds a mirror in his hand and looks into the mirror sometimes to check, you know, which way round it is, and sometimes holds a mirror underneath so that he actually turns the head of the sitter upside down in the mirror and then paints from there. So it makes it more and more of an abstracted shape to try and get the structure right. And he was explaining all this to me while he was doing it. It was absolutely fascinating.
Surely one Morecroft face is horror enough for anyone to cope with.
Instead of two.
Explain why you do that.
Look, Richard, it's about having, again, to not worry about a likeness. And when you turn something upside down, it's a tonal thing, purely. I mean, amongst the artists, amongst everybody here, would probably understand that, but the tone is important, and the mirror brings out those tonal ranges a lot easier. I do that on a frequent basis to look at the work upside down. Yes.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Now tell me.
I should say too that in my studio I have a huge mirror, which is probably about maybe nearly 2 metres by a metre, and I'm constantly looking in that mirror when I'm doing a portrait. Because it's, when something is back the front, it's always a bit of an artist's trick. If you've got to look at something back the front, it'll always tell you what's wrong with it.
Okay, but
Yeah,
but suddenly it's
and-
obvious when you talk about your interest in shapes,
Yeah.
why you're interested in Richard, because he's got a very, if you don't mind me saying,
Yeah.
a very kind of angled, interesting face, hasn't he?
Well,
the planes of his
Yeah,
face are
Yeah,
interesting.
you've described the reasons why I painted Richard, you see. So you didn't have to ask me that question.
Why did you
yeah.
paint Richard?
Yeah, but they are the reasons. I think-
Are they? Is that right?
Yeah, that's true. I
How,
think
how would
Rich-
you describe his face?
I-
What, what are you interested in this
I particularly
face?
like the way Richard's face has those angles and sharp angles. I'll be very careful here.
Go for it.
But it is those angles. In fact, I often thought that when I saw Richard for the first time, he'd make a great sculpture. Like if it was
I
a
think
cube-
the
like a
Easter
cube-
Islanders already did him.
Yeah. Okay. But like a cubist sculpture would be. I kept thinking of it in terms of cubism. That the work, you carve into the paint.
How does this make you feel?
Yeah.
Oh look, I was just delighted and I guess very flattered that that Peter was interested, because I should say, to provide a little background at this stage, that Peter and I had got to know each other a little before he asked me about the painting. And in fact, the first time that I met Peter, I don't know whether you remember this, but
Yeah, I do.
I asked for his autograph.
That's right.
And the reason that I did that was my partner, Alison Mackay, is a painter, and she had particularly admired Peter's work for quite a number of years. And I went along to an exhibition of his which Alison couldn't get to, and I had the opportunity to be introduced to Peter. And I thought, great, I'll take home the exhibition brochure and I'll get his autograph and I'll give it to Alison. And so we actually met, and I was in autograph hunter mode. And then some time later, we met again at Bundanon, the wonderful property that Arthur Boyd and his wife.
Which
have
you're
owned.
a trustee of, aren't
Well,
you?
and I was going to say I'm fortunate enough to be a trustee of Bundanon, and I was attending Bundanon for an event, and it just so happened, I didn't realise, but just so happened that Peter was an artist in residence at Bundanon at the time. So we said hello, and because Alison and I live not very far away, we invited Peter back for dinner, and the three of us, kind of got to know each
And
other a bit
he
better.
saw that angular face. Well, this
Yeah,
is where we
that's
come to the matter of personality, because some people say that portraiture is a way of seeing into the soul of a person, and yet you've talked to us this evening more about the kind of delightful, interesting
Yeah.
angles of Richard's face. Is
Yeah.
it a method of seeing into the soul of someone?
Well, to be able to see into the soul, you still got to articulate that paint. I still think, I have this theory that you can have a really good likeness, but it's not a good painting. And you can have I think the gift is, in fact, to have both, to have a good likeness and a painting that's really reasonably painted. But back to the soul, that's I think often too that the character of someone comes from often the person who looks at the work. You always bring in your own prejudices when you look at a painting. So the people who know Richard and see the painting downstairs may have a different view of it.
But did you
because
feel you were trying to express
Well,
part of his
I
character?
wanted a very quietly spoken portrait. I didn't want something loud. And that's how I...
Because you felt that grew out of this person he was.
I think there's we portray different personalities in ourselves, and that's how I wanted to see Richard with this painting.
Compare it to us. You're a very successful portrait artist. You've been a finalist for the Doug Moran Prize 4 times, won it once. It's a huge prize, $100,000. You've been a finalist in this prize 3 times.
Yeah.
How different does the work become depending on the sitter?
I think it's actually a lot easier if you know the person. For me, it is. And the reason, because you know somebody, is that there's this whole thing about expectation. And when somebody, with all the portraits I've done for the Moran Prize and all the Archibald have been people I've known. So there's that sense that you don't have. The worst thing is to worry about what someone will think of the work. Actually, look, I shouldn't even think in those terms. but you don't have to worry about expectation. The only expectation is for me. That's how I see the work. In the very end, if I like it, I'll exhibit it. If I don't like it, even if the sitter likes it, but I don't, I probably wouldn't put the work in.
But is your ambition about the extent to which you're trying to capture soul or capture character compared to your interest in tonal shapes, does that shift according to your friendship with the subject, your knowledge of the subject?
Oh, that's a tricky question, I reckon. Often the painting will be a composition may add to that, where you place somebody in the picture frame. All of those things sort of have a way of distilling some sort of character of the person, and that's the sort of thing that you can bring out. I mean, you talk about expression, emotional portraits. I was down this afternoon, and I take my sketchbook with me everywhere, but there's some beautiful psychological portraits downstairs of Mike Parrs and their drawings. I think they're absolutely superb. Absolutely beautiful portraits. That's what I'd call a psychological portrait. They are. But they're self-portraits as well. Yeah. And the other person, I mean, like in art history, you've got someone like Sue Teen, who was a fantastic portrait painter. And they are themselves quite beautiful paintings, but disturbing at the same time.
Tell me about the one that won you the Moran Prize in, I think it was 2006, because this was somebody you knew very well, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah. Well, I mean, the portrait of Graham Doyle, but Graham has been a friend of mine for the last 25 years, and for those who don't know, I've been painting Graham every 2 weeks for the last 25 years. So I have hundreds of portraits of Graham, but this is out of friendship that we meet, and it's out of friendship that I paint Graham. So
well, what are you going to do with all these portraits?
Well,
what happens to them?
Yeah, what do you do with them all? I think, well, actually, I built myself a huge shed to put them in, but I think one day I'd like to show them all as a collective, because not only are you painting somebody as a physical person, but you're actually tracing their life after 25 years.
And the changes in their face.
And the changes in their face, yeah. So what I'm really doing is I'm documenting somebody, like if a photographer would document somebody. I'm documenting Graham. But at the same time, not only am I documenting Graham, I'm actually documenting the way I paint after 25 years.
So he changes and you change.
Exactly. My work has changed tremendously over the last 25 years. And that keystone has been the continuity from those very early portraits to the one which won the Moran Prize.
It's like the portrait of the Dorian Gray, except it really does get older.
Yeah, that's true.
Amazing.
Yes.
Now let's talk about the moment of revelation, because he has stopped you looking at the portrait whilst he's been dancing around as you described it, and you're sitting there nervously in the chair thinking, cripes, how's this going to come out? There is a moment, I take it, when he invites you to examine the damage.
Well, the interesting thing was that the portrait, as it is hanging downstairs now, I didn't see in its finished form until it was hanging on the wall. What I got to see after our time together was a work in progress. So the finished version of it, I didn't get to see until it was actually completely finished.
Still, there's a moment, I'm sure, where you saw it.
There was a moment of revelation, and look, it was very interesting to be able to see something that was recognisably me, that was, I suppose, really what had been happening, which was relatively quietly and thoughtfully. Peter had been working, well, in fact, quite vigorously, and I'd just been sitting there, kind of quietly and thoughtfully having a conversation with him. And I quite liked the fact that the portrait was quiet and thoughtful. It wasn't, it wasn't big and full of pizzazz. It was a gentle exploration of the conversation we'd just been having.
Well, he's doing Jeffrey Edelson next year, so he's saving up. He's saving up for that. Yeah. And Richard says that that it's not entirely finished at that point. What happens next? What happens once he goes away?
Well, actually, I had an idea when I first saw Richard. I had this great idea. I'm going to do a triptych. I'm going to have 3 panels, and those 3. The painting itself is very small, so it's only 20 centimetres by 20 centimetres. So I had an idea of having 1, 2, 3 together, and I did variations of the other 2. But when I put them all up, there was something that didn't fit and they didn't speak to each other, which a painting should do. And so I just decided to pick the one portrait. My surprise was, I suppose, that it's such a small portrait would get into the Archibald Prize.
It's small and intense and closely cropped,
yes,
actually.
Yeah.
And I wonder, when I saw it, I also wondered, because your Moran Prize-winning portrait, for instance, is a kind of bigger view. It takes in the chair and the man.
That's right.
And whether you decide on that right at the beginning of the process, of that this is going to be the size of the snapshot, if you like, or that this is going to be the size of the snapshot. At what point do you decide that?
Well, I think those small portraits I've been doing, what they do is they almost speak to me myself. I think that a small portrait is something that you walk up to, and there's an intimacy to it. So you actually have to go up to that portrait and let it speak to you. Whereas a large portrait, and I'm sort of partly against, not so much against, but the big heads are a different way of painting. And the large head would probably, what it does, it asks you to be noticed. It shouts at you to come, look at me, look at me. So in a way, the intimacy of a small portrait is what I was after, and a close-up. So, when you look at Richard, you've got to go right up to that portrait and have a look. And the surface is a little bit different than the surface I've usually painted with. I've been using a lot of wax, beeswax in the paint. So that's where the surface is a lot different than I normally paint.
You've been so interested in art yourself. You mentioned Alison. I mentioned Bundanon. You've got you love photography, for instance. Have you been tempted to try to steal the paints and have a go?
Well, it's certainly not at the sort of level that Peter's involved with. I am, how can I put this, enthusiastic about the process of creating images. I've got a small exhibition happening at the moment as part of the Head On Photographic Festival, so I do exhibit photographs. I think painting portraits must be one of the most demanding, exacting, and very specific skills. I think there are many different types of painting, but probably nothing more challenging than trying to paint a portrait. So I think I'd have to have a big injection of courage to head in that direction.
It's been so, if we haven't excited everyone's interested to see this particular portrait, I'd be surprised. But hopefully we will send people downstairs. From your eyes, what else should we look at? Obviously we all think this combination is the best painting down there, but what else?
Well, actually, I still think that they probably did pick the winner. I think the Ben Quilt is actually a very good painting.
That's the painting you would pick as the winner?
Yeah,
I would
have picked that. And then there's the one of Richard's friend,
David
Astle, which I think is a great painting. Yeah,
it's basically dominated by letters and numbers down there.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. Yeah. Yeah, I joked to a friend of mine recently. I said, I guess the only next thing to do is paint Lily, of course.
Yeah. But for people who are about to go down and see it, what to your artist's eyes is remarkable about the quilty? Because I know this is one of the few years where Edmund has agreed with the judges instead of slagging them off publicly as he usually does. A lot of people seem to agree that this is an extraordinary picture. Yeah. Why?
Well, look, it's... What Ben Quilty's done is put on really thick paint. It's actually almost delicious. I use that word as an artist, but the paint quality I particularly like. He has really laid it on, and the colour in that painting is absolutely beautiful. And he's done what a lot of artists have never really done, and he's left all that white surface in the middle. And often an artist will paint the portrait right in the middle of the portrait and leave the white on the outside. But he's done what Margaret Olley told him to do, and that is paint to the edges. I remember her saying that. But there's a contrast for me, is that the quality of the paintwork, which is like really thick and gutsy, is almost a juxtaposition to the sensitivity of Margaret Olley herself. Like there's two elements. You've got one, this great painting, which is really strong and bold and very masculine, but in itself it represents this very charming and beautiful woman.
You've
So that's what
captured
I-
it. That's brilliant. I think that's brilliant. Have people seen this yet?
Yeah.
Isn't that wonderful? That's a beautiful way of expressing it. Richard, what about you? Aside from this extraordinary portrait of this incredibly handsome man, what else? What else would you look? Caught your eye down there?
Well, look, I would have to, funnily enough, agree with some of the things that Peter said. I did think the portrait of Margaret was an outstanding and absolutely the right winner. I thought the portrait of David Astle was delightful, and so I think there are a lovely range of things to explore down there. I think one of the great things this year is that there is a lot of variety. Everything is not enormous. There are some really nice other small portraits. The small portrait of Lewis Miller, for example, is a lovely but very modestly scaled work. I think.
I agree with that. I think it's a rather beautiful little painting.
Yeah, well, there's lots of things to look at down there. I mentioned on the radio tonight that I think this is the best dating scene in Sydney. It is full of extraordinarily good-looking people, very well dressed from town, and they come around and stand in front of these paintings. And the trick is to go up to the best-looking person you can see and say, "It's marvellous, isn't it?" Fall into conversation with them and then invite them for a glass of wine downstairs. You can't miss. Please thank Peter and Richard, and enjoy the Archibald this year. Thank you for coming.